Thanks, Dee. Yeah, so we will talk. We'll start with some questions for the group, and then about half an hour from now, we will open up for questions from all of you. We do want this to be an interactive conversation. You can start at any point, just chatting to Deirdre, saying I have a question or asking a question, and when the time comes, she will she'll unmute your mic and let you ask the question directly to our panelists. I am really just thrilled to welcome three of our great friends here who have been in the Logan Festival. They represent all 3 years of our Logan Festival here, actually, and that's been really wonderful. In our very first Logan Festival, we were thrilled to bring my friend Juan Francisco Villa and his show Empanada for a Dream. This is when I said to Juan, hey, we're going to do this thing where I think we're going to just do solo work and bring everybody together, and I don't know if anybody's going to show up. And at that time, it wasn't the Logan Festival. The Logans hadn't come on to sponsor, and I said, we'll find the money, but I don't know where it's coming from. And Juan said, great, when should I be there? And we are thrilled that he was. And of course, you also know Juan's work at First Stage. He co-directed both Jesus Hop the A Train and Columbinus with me, and is nominated for a Helen Hayes Award this year as well. Kate Alexander was in our second and third solo festival. She's a director coming to us, and Juan's coming to us from Los Angeles, I should say. Kate's coming to us from Florida. And Kate was the director of Absolute Brightness and The Things They Carried was last year. She is the only artist in the solo festival who's been there twice. So it's so wonderful to create family that way. And Kate has absolutely become part of the First Stage family, and we're grateful to her for being here.
Thanks.
And Khanisha Foster, you all saw last summer, and her wonderful play, Joy Rebel, which was really, for many of us, one of those plays where we walked out of the theater just totally changed. And it may be one of the shows I get the most questions and the most responses of. And she joins us from Los Angeles as well. So thanks, Khanisha.
Are you ready?
So I just want to take a moment. I think it would be silly not to acknowledge that when I asked these folks to come be part of this conversation several weeks ago, they signed up for it at a world that was very much in uncertainty, but not the world that turned out to be this Saturday. So I just want to start by saying thank you to you all for being here and to continuing engaging in the conversation here, and to acknowledge that that everybody is a little bit exhausted and a little bit raw, and it really is generous and giving of everybody in this Zoom room to be with us. So thank you all for that. I want to start by talking to Juan and Khanisha, who both not only are performers, but is not always true of our solo shows. They are the writers, and they are autobiographical pieces that they work on. And I wonder if both of you might talk about why you created a solo show. What was it about the medium that made you get into it? You both were probably known to most of us in the theater world as performers at that time. What was it about solo work that felt like what was it about the medium that made you want to tell your story?
Go ahead, Khanisha.
Who's gonna go first? Okay. Yeah, I'll share. Hi everybody. Thank you for being here. So for me, I started as an actor, and if you got to see the show, you already know that I'm mixed race and black and white. And I found as an actor, it was nearly impossible to find a character that was black and white to play on stage. So, and at first I thought I wasn't doing enough work. But I've read a play a week since I was 14 years old. So that's more than 20 years of play reading. And I realized at some point it wasn't me, like that those characters were actually missing. And I really wanted to be able to like be in my voice in an authentic way. And then I told this story to these guys yesterday, but there's this company called Second Story in Chicago, and they used to be a new play festival. And I was fresh out of college. I was doing a show with them, and like when you're backstage in a show, everybody kind of tells their stories, you know, and while everyone else is on stage. And I had a smaller part in the show, so I'd been largely quiet and kind of in the corner of the room. And one day we were telling stories, and I was like, oh yeah, well, this one time my dad robbed a bank. And the whole room was like, what? And I was like, oh, right, not a normal story that people tell. And so they had started this thing to invest in their artists, where they were helping people to write their own stories and do creative nonfiction. And they would fuse it with music and wine and perform it at wine bars. So you'd have a wine paired with your story. And this is where I met Alex, actually. You'd have a wine paired. He was one of my first directors there. You'd have a wine paired with your story, and then you'd have a musician who basically scored your life, and you'd tell these stories. And so my stories kind of preceded me because my parents have sort of a wild life experience. My dad was a Black Panther and a career criminal for a long time because of a lot of the injustice in this country actually led him down that path. He's a very brilliant and passionate man. And then my mother's family invented bubble wrap and brought Piggly Wiggly to the Midwest. So you can imagine, I can't just like casually tell a story. It's like sort of already a play. So I started to write stories with them. And then I found that I could actually be in my real voice, which as an actor, people were asking me to take on other people's voices. And what I really realized, and I say in the show, is I'd never sounded like myself on stage before. And my voice is gonna sound different. You know, if I'm talking to my father, it takes on a different kind of tone and resonancy. It sits in a different part of my body. If I'm talking to my mother, it gets kind of higher and like, oh my God, you know, because that's how she talks. So we start to speak that way. And I wanted my voice to be able to do more than one thing on stage.
Yeah, Juan,
That's great.
How about you?
That's great. It's just another example, because I lived in Chicago also, which is how I met Alex and Khanisha. Just how you can peripherally be around artists or go to certain events, because everyone has small types of events. And I remember going to Second Story the first time and being blown away by people telling their stories. And at that point, my solo play there was no seed of it at all. If anything, I just admired that people were sharing what I thought were skeletons in their closet, and I could feel myself gravitating towards it and pulling towards it. And I was told a couple of times, like, you should write something. And I was like, yeah, I want to, but just too afraid, until I reached 32, and my stepfather had passed away suddenly. And I had pieced together that the men, especially on my mom's side of the family, nobody reached the age of 33, from my mother's father, from when he was murdered, due to just a rage of jealousy from his best friend, onto my uncles. And so I was 32, and I was like, I don't believe in God, and I was an altar boy, but I think I believe in him. So I think something's going to happen. I'm going to atone for my family's sins, even though I believed I did nothing wrong. And I just had a lot of insomnia. And I just thought, well, if I'm going to go, I think I got to just tell some stories and just put it on the page, so that, I don't know, I guess I was thinking of some legacy, or at least that I tried. And I spent a few weeks journaling. It was really journaling. That's all it was. And it was a stream of consciousness. Anyone who's done the artist way, you just know that that's all I did in the mornings. And I shared, actually in 2010, I did the first Chicago Fringe Festival, and I had someone else who was involved in directing it. And I did a 45-minute version, and it was a very, I grew up on TV and sitcoms, and it was very, very much like that. Here's some crazy stories. And I'm just going to casually just mention that my uncle, did a Colombian necktie on someone, cut his throat, and then pulled his tongue out. All right, on to the next moment. That was, it was big denial on my end. And then I shared those writings with Alex. He was running a Ballybeck Theater Company in New York City, and then he just approached me and was he said there was something there, which meant a lot because Alex has a high bar for theater, and I just thought, okay, and he said let's put it up. And then and I say that in the sense of, I would say 75%, maybe 70% of the play was there before we started rehearsals, and then began the questions of Alex as a director, the questions that I do to people, where I'm just asking questions, and we dug deeper and deeper. I had also shared stories with Alex, and he said, I know there's more there. And I wanted him to tell me what it was, and he said, "No, your way is more interesting than anything that I could come up with." And we dug deep, and that was in 2012, and it had a strong response, and it took me to Chicago a couple of times, and I did it in New York a couple of times, and then in LA, and then I've done it I use it as a tool for the juvenile detention centers when I go in. When I talk to them, to help them tell their stories, to empower them to see that they have something to say, as opposed to buying music, buying films, and giving them money. It's like, you can do it yourself. You can make money too. And high schools, I go to high schools and colleges. So that's what was the impetus for the play.
I saw it in Chicago. It was so good. I was like fangirling out. I've told many people about it.
And so, that we get some idea of how it starts, and I want to transition really for all three of you, but I'll start with Kate about what happens when you go from telling your own story and sort of starting to put it on paper that is yours and is meant to be performed and is really, solo work, and when it stops being solo work and you start to go into a rehearsal room, and how that process is different than a normal process might be. And Kate, maybe you can start us as a director about what it feels like to be in a room with just a solo performer, rehearsing and developing work versus a normal production, which is going to have lots of people, depending on the size of the show, in the room with you. What is that experience of being in the rehearsal room for solo work?
Yeah, and lots of egos, to be honest. You're always navigating all like 10 different processes. I love being alone with an actor. You get more and more refined. It's almost like any intimate relationship. You get to know them. You hear the whispers. I think as a director, and I'm working in one now, it's my job to give space. And it's my job not to impose my voice as much, but to cull. And I liken it to just culling and something ancient. So my job is to give so much space and listen to whispers, and even to where the artist may not even know where they're going. They may not be aware yet. There's kind of that unconscious within us. And our job is to let the room have the ghosts. And let the room have, there's a line I love, a rehearsal room has to be filled with the blood of all your bad choices. So we have to have bloody walls.
There's a lot of them.
Right, hopefully they're successful. It's so rich and dense, and it gets deeper and quieter. And then I find the boundaries blur. Like break is still working, where when I'm working with 10 actors, you go on break, nobody wants to see the director. They want to go smoke or swear or whatever you have to do to process and get away from me. In this, it all becomes blurry of when we're playing, when we're working, and when we're not. And the one other thing I'd like to add, and I want to just go back because it mirrors, Khanisha, I love what you said about voice. So I want to talk about working with women actresses in these situations. We never heard a woman's voice in public until 1645. Her name was Peg Hurt. This means Shakespeare, for centuries, over 10 centuries, no woman's voice was allowed in public. And after that, it was illegal. You were a prostitute, you were terrible. Through the 18th century, the suffragist movements, it was the worst thing you could do. Women turned to writing because it was easier and more accepted than speaking. So when you talk about woman's voice, it is imperative. There are chambers, women, and the women in our audience, me included, we don't even use in our bodies yet because that voice has not even been realized. We haven't had the centuries of time to get the vibrancy. So working with a female solo and male are different, but ultimately it's about giving space.
That's great. Juan and Khanisha, can you talk about being on the other side of that? What it is to start to share your story with another person in the process, and how that process works, especially as both writer, performer, walking in with the director.
Yeah, I had you were very sensitive to the process, and it was probably the first time in a rehearsal room where I felt like I could go through the gamut of and the rainbow of emotions, and without feeling like I'm going to be judged, because as Kate just pointed out, things are being unearthed, exhumed from the ground. And so, I remember being told a long time ago, it was like shamans, actors are like shamans. And I thought when something this autobiographical, then yes, if you haven't fully explored that, then there are going to be things that you're processing, but you don't want to process it without putting it on the page, or else it's going to be processed and then you want to hide from it, which I know people who are like that, and it's like whatever helps you survive. But it was difficult. Like I had a very difficult time, and even when I perform it again, I have to have a lot of self-care. But the journey of hear all these stories, Khanisha, you mentioned before about and it was my first time like writing at this level, that I wanted to throw everything in the kitchen sink in there. And so, and Luis Alfaro talks about it a lot. He said his first couple plays is like everything. And it's like, no, just find the seed. And what if it doesn't support this story, this scene doesn't support what we're trying to say, then it needs to go out and it's for something else, which is a scary thing, because when it's the first time you're getting everything out, it can be a little addictive. And so I had a lot of trust in you and Alex. And so if anything, you pushed me, and you knew that I could probably rise up to it. And sometimes talking about it, a lot of the writing, there's some of the stories in the solo play, they're from oral storytelling. So it wasn't that I sat down to write it. It's that it's like, sitting around in a campfire, and it's like, oh yeah, this story about my uncle, this story about my grandmother. And then I transcribe it. And then I think that comes more natural to people. So, so that was sort of the journey there, developing with you. And you had a few, many times you reminded me, Juan, the actor, needs to listen to Juan, the writer, and go back to the script and make sure you're honoring what was written there. It was written there for a reason. So that's still something that runs through my head.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I mean, Juan and I would often say, is this a writer problem? Is this a performer problem? Which Juan do I need to be talking to right now? How did that work for you, Khanisha? How did you figure out what was, as a performer, you're always fixing the text in some way, to some extent. At what points were you fixing it as actor, and what points were you fixing as writer? And how conscious are you of that when you're doing it?
I'm too conscious. I'm a thinker. I'm always like, what's happening? What's going on? But yes. So Lou Bellamy was my director, and if you're not familiar with Lou is like one of the greats of the American theater. He's someone I had heard about for decades. I'd read about. He was one of August Wilson's closest people. He was a founding member of Penumbra Theater, which is the second oldest African-American theater company in the country, a place I dreamed of working when I was young. So, and his daughter, Sarah, who's also mixed race, runs Penumbra now, and we've known each other a long time. And they were doing a year curating mixed race work. And she wrote to me and she was like, do you have a solo show about mixedness? And I was like, oh, my life's work? Yes, I do. But I'd been developing it based on these second story stories. So they commissioned it. So I sent them these 3 stories that I thought could become this bigger piece. And I was really, really nervous because I started as an actor. And when I started writing, I let my acting sell the writing. And then I was performing with people that were such high level writers that I didn't want to rest on one skill. I wanted to develop them all, you know, and I was lucky enough to be training with people who were brilliant writers and generous spirits. And I would train them on performance and they would train me on writing. And, you know, obviously there's a little bit of ego in that. Like Lee was always like, you're not going to do a solo show if you don't have a little bit of ego. Like, you know, you're not going to get up there and be like, just me for a while, everybody, let's go. But you know, I wanted my writing to be better. And so I always get a little nervous, even though I made a career at writing. It's what I get paid most to do. I always get a little nervous sending the script when they haven't heard my voice in it. Cause I'm like, is it doing what I think it does when I'm not giving all this, like this performance with it? And Sarah left me this message that I still have to this day that really moves me about how it moved her. And it was particularly poignant for me because Sarah's one of the first people I ever sat across from. The first time we met, we were young leaders of color for the theater communications group. They flew us in, sat us across a table. It's the only time in my life I've looked across a table and saw someone who looked like me. So I was like, who is she? So it's just really profound for me that somebody who really aligned with my story, connected to it. I mean, it's something I want to reach everybody, but and then her father directing it, here's this man who was a Black radical. My father was a Black radical. He understood that. He treated my father in the story lovingly, which was important to me when he was directing it. In fact, every brother in the show, he'd be like, even the taxi driver, if you saw it, he'd be like, are you being nice to the taxi driver? You know, I'd be like, yes, I am. This is a real taxi driver. Just let me say what he said. But he would tell me at the end of the process, like when it was time to be, after the drafts were done, he would say, stop writing, Khanisha. And I'd like, don't you think I'd come in and be like, I was working on this part and could we just cut the top and do, and he'd be like, stop writing. Because there is a point where the actor does have to figure out if it works in their body, you know, and if your brain is always on in both places, then you're not totally present on stage. So it doesn't mean you can't have epiphanies or make changes, but for me, I had to make a decision. I'm an actor now. And now I have to figure out what to do with this text in front of me.
That's great. That segues real, and I see Dee mentioned in the chat, I've not done my job of reminding everybody that if you have questions, I'll turn it over for questions in about 10 minutes. So just at any point, just let Dee know that you have a question and we'll get to him soon, I promise. But I do want to sort of talk about that a little bit of you know, that next step, of course, becomes about putting it in front of an audience. And what it is to do solo work with an audience. How is the relationship with the audience different than when you're on stage normally? And also, you know, Juan and Khanisha, you've had the opportunity to perform your shows in many different stages, and I think it's really interesting as a solo performer. As a solo performer is sort of giving themselves to the audience. I know that, you know, for both of you, you started your shows in a place, literally in a place with an audience that was perhaps a little bit more connected to your story, to your identity, and then moved it to other audiences as well. And I wonder if you talk about, you know, both what it is to be in front of an audience as a solo performer, but also how that relationship changes from night to night and place to place.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
I mean, I just love to talk about the audience because they're the most sacred part of the experience. And I don't mean sacred as in like untouchable. I mean that there's no reason to do it. There's no reason to do it if you're not there having a shared experience. And so solo show is called solo, right? But you have your whole collaborative team and then you don't know what it's going to be until the audience is there. You think you know. And Joy Rebel is interesting because it started as stories where I was literally, some of those stories I sat on top of a bar and told them a foot away from someone the first time I said them, you know, and that's a really different experience. People have drinks in hand and they're encouraged to be in conversation with each other, and they can reach out to you right after and talk to you about your story. That's part of what we do. I tell my story, so you tell yours. So it was always built so that we could be in conversation with each other, the audience and I. And then it is interesting, yeah, because obviously I talk about different parts of my identity, and a lot of the work I do is about how I'm not singular. And I think a lot of people don't define themselves as singular. And there's this study that says people find mixed identity, what's it called? People find it, I'll remember the word for it in a moment, but they cognitively disorienting, because our subconscious tells us that people should be one thing, and if they're more than one thing, they're lying. So because of that, our brains sort of naturally try to make them one thing. And I realized that doing a study on mixedness that I did for 2 years, and I was like, you know, that's a problem for my body. You know, it's a problem because I am more than one thing, and I am an honest person, and I was struggling with the idea that people wanted to adjust my body for their understanding. So and everybody, not just one person, you know, our one group of people. So it's very interesting doing Joy Rebel, because I talk about being Black, and I talk about being white, and I talk about being mixed, and I take on all these voices, and I talk about people perceiving me as other things. And at Penumbra, again, as a predominantly African American theater, so the parts of my Black identity that I talk about, the audience is very, very loud during those parts, right? So, and then, you know, when I was with you all, when I talked about my grandmother on my mom's side, my white grandmother, who is my kindred spirit, who's the closest thing to me, the audience was maybe the most connected it felt to me around those parts. And I could be wrong, I don't want to put thoughts in your mind, but vocally responsive. And what an interesting experience that was, you know, because they're all just as important to me. But what an interesting experience to feel where people seem to be connecting to my story, where it seems to be familiar to them, or where it seems to be far away to them, which both aspects are important. I intentionally put things that'll feel close to some and far from others. So it was, I mean, you know, sacred time to play.
Would you say, Khanisha, was this scarier to perform for an audience like that, or for your family? I mean, was there a deep fear somewhere?
Oh, boy. My family came to see it. My family knows what I write about, first of all. I have their blessings. So there's no disrespect in my writing to people that I love. Like, I tell them, my father always encouraged me to write about it, because he always wished he could tell the stories. But I will tell you, at Penumbra, before I got to come to you all, my sister sat in the front row, and my mother came.
Front row.
And my sister is 1.5 years older than me. I have younger siblings that are like a decade younger, but my sister's the only one that was there for all of it. And sorry if people are not familiar with the play, be happy to answer questions about it. If you're like, what are you talking about? What happens in your play? But, you know, I talk about some very intimate things that happened in our childhood. The opening is a real story of when I was a little girl, and we weren't allowed to let my father in the house. Both my parents were struggling with addiction when I was young. And my sister led him up the stairs, and I tried to hide the TV before he got up the stairs, because I knew he would try to steal it. And he caught me. And he sat me down, and like, he was crying and telling me about how bad I had made him feel, and how bad it made him feel that I would think of him that way. And I felt terrible. And then, you know, I felt terrible, and he left, and I was like, you know, like trying to stop crying. And then my mom came up the stairs, and she had the TV under her arm, and she had the VCR under her arm, and she was like, was your father here? And I was like, no. And I just like, it was like, and I talk about in the show, it was like a magic trick, because I thought I hadn't stopped looking at him the whole time. And somehow he had gotten these things out of the house. And it, you know, there's the hurt of that. There's very real hurt of that. Obviously, you know, it affects your ability to trust, not just others, but your own eyes. But it also, it just affects how you see the world. So anyway, I write about things like that. And my sister was in the room for that. My sister had that same experience. She's the only person who was in the room for that. And there's this part of the show at the end where I'm talking to my sister on the phone, and I do both of our voices, and I could hear my sister crying. You know, I could hear her, you know, like, and I could hear her breathing the way that I imitate her breathing in the piece. And then we went out to dinner after, and her husband is this, you know, like ginormous 6'7" man, very sweet man. And he said, "Did that really happen, everything in your solo show?" And I was a little confused because she's married to him. I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "You've never told me any of that," to my sister. And she was like, "Yeah." So I just like told everybody, like, you never tell any, but that's how we are. I talk about things she doesn't. The other weird thing is my mom, who I almost never, I'm just starting to fully write about her because she almost lives in this like fantasy of herself, which is beautiful. She has much joy, but she hears what she wants to hear. So she'll be like, "Oh, that was terrible, that thing that happened with your father. But anyway," you know, like she doesn't hear the parts that are, she just chooses not to hear them. So.
Yeah, no, it's I've loved doing the solo play for high school students. It just feels like they're, because I mean, the protagonist of Juan is mainly young for the majority of the play. So and it's mainly through the eyes of a younger Juan. And so there's, you know, an exaggerated version of my mom, like a decrepit 800-year-old witch. So I think kids just get off on that. They're like, ah, they go crazy. And just because theater is looked at a certain way as you're not supposed to curse, you're supposed to be respectful, and you know, on the stage, in my solo play, but definitely the best theater in my mind is the ones that do things that that are a little feel a little dangerous, and you're not supposed to be talking about that or saying that. So in high school students, I just love it. But before my first performance, I was deathly afraid of doing it in front of my family. Even though also I had years before I had asked my mom about if I could write about my uncles, which I think I had mentioned before, of them being drug kingpins in the Lower East Side, and smuggling cocaine and selling it all over LES, ruining a lot of New York through that. And then they also murdered people, sometimes family of my friends that I grew up with. And she said no. And then when my stepfather died, I think something happened where she just felt like, you know what, like, why should there be shame? And I said, great. Okay, I'll see. I don't know. And I wrote it, and then the first in my mind, it was gonna go the way it goes for John Leguizamo in Freak, where he's like on Broadway, and then his father like shows up, and that's like the first time his father or someone in his family has seen it. No, it's the first workshop like performance of it in New York. That my mom's like, "When's the show?" I'm like, "Oh, the first performance is on this day." And she just thought, "Oh, great, that's opening." I'm like, "No, it's not. It's the first show." "What do you mean it's not opening? That's the first show." A back and forth and trying to explain the logistics of previews, workshopping, and opening. But she wanted to go, and she wanted to make empanadas for everyone. And I was freaking out, and I had to like kind of. Alex was very supportive, but I had to like walk myself through it of if my family disowns me, I do, and if my family disowns me, if my friends want nothing to do with me, and if I get blacklisted in the theater community because of what I'm sharing, whether it's bad or that it's just not done well, am I still interested in telling the story? Is it important to me? And I said, yeah. And everything in me said, if all three things happen, I believe in this. I don't have, it's not bad intentions. It's honestly with a lot of love. And did the performance. Some people knew my mom was there, so they were kind of like watching her watch this story. I think to see if I'm bullshitting or exaggerating or she's gonna be offended. And no, she sat through it, and she only disputed one thing, and it has to do with the McDonald's story. For anyone who knows the McDonald's story, she just said it wasn't her; it was her sister, my aunt, my tia Marta, who encouraged me to drink something to make me feel better. And so from that point on, it would just seem like, I don't care. Honestly, I got past that, and there was a lot of love behind it. and turmoil, and a lot of healing started happening in my family. And I am also the person, whenever I'm in New York, even when I was living there, we would have like these sibling dinners, and I'm like, all right, let's talk about it, because everyone's telling me things, expecting me to fix everything or be the person who's talking about it. And I'm like, nope, you need to talk to each other. And we will have these dinners, sometimes with my mom, sometimes without her. And we just like, I'm like, just say it and let's just talk through it. And it's helped us tremendously. So, so I'm not as worried in front of who. I think as I'm getting older a little bit, I think as politics have shifted, maybe not shifted, but especially in 2016 with things that happened then, I was worried it was going to be used as a tool for maybe the immigration situation here in this country. And that worried me, because it's like, that's not, you can look at it in one light, but there's a whole other slew of good people from my family who immigrated here, and me being one of them, a second generation immigrant. So that is sometimes a concern, but you know, I just commit to just doing it and trusting whoever's presenting it, that there'll be a dialogue with the audience.
Perfect segue, Juan. Because I'm gonna now. I know we have a couple questions, so I wanna give that opportunity. So Deirdre, can you? I'm turning it over to you.
Hello, we have a question from Eileen. Eileen, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. Hello. I love both of your shows, and neither one of you did what I'm going to ask you about, but maybe in a first iteration you did. How do you keep your piece from being an egocentric sort of verbal diarrhea?
Oh, so good. Yes. It's like the most valuable question. It really is. And it's tricky. It's like tricky to begin because you're like, I'm going to write about myself, and then I'm gonna talk about myself for like an hour or more. And like, why? But I mean, I think you gotta have eyes on it. You gotta have it like people you trust looking at it. You gotta write. Sometimes you have to start by writing from ego, and then be very. Oh, what's up, Brian? Hi, Brian.
How's it going, yo?
Be very willing to slice. You know, like to actually question yourself and push yourself and take away something that can be really beautifully written, but it doesn't serve the piece. It's not part of the story. But you know, you have to be. I think it goes back actually to what Kate said. It's like you have to leave your failures on the rehearsal room floor, because if there's no way you're going to write a piece and never focus on yourself in a way. And also, I also think that, forgive me for talking around this, but I'm interested in the science of story. And there's a lot of science that says the way we tell our story is how we see ourselves. And actually changing the way we place ourselves in the story can change our whole view of ourselves. So, you know, when I survived as a kid, one of the ways I survived was making myself the hero of my own stories, you know? So I wasn't necessarily the hero, but I had to make myself the hero to just feel like I could achieve the next thing and the next thing, and that I wasn't going to be held back by these choices that my parents had made. So I think it's also important to look at your story and guess, who am I? What are my flaws? What did I do wrong? What was I really like at that time? I'll put on music that I couldn't stop listening to during that time of my life, because you'll remember yourself as a hero, and then you'll put on a song you listen to and you'll remember, like, while you're brushing your teeth, you'll remember some shitty things you did. And then you have to tell the audience that you did those shitty things. You have to tell them. You can't hold everybody accountable but yourself. You know, a lot of the second piece of my thing is about people thinking that I look like different races and asking me to play those parts. If I had told that story without admitting that I played those parts, then that's not right, you know? And I'm deeply embarrassed about that. You know, like I'm getting emotional. I was young and I made choices, but they were the wrong choices. And I'm so ashamed of that. And if I'm gonna try to tell everybody else's shame, I gotta tell mine too, so that we can learn from it.
Yeah, I still think it's still a concern for me. So I remember being the protagonist of Juan is still the most annoying character to me. I just had he's no fun. I think he's complaining about everything. He's feeling so much, and so I actually did not enjoy that. I enjoyed looking at things from the other point of view. Maybe I feel like I could explore more through their eyes. But Alex helped me just dig deeper for the Juan character. And I remember just for stuff that was touched on earlier, just reaching a point of, oh my God, I'm just like talking and talking and talking, like who's gonna want to listen to me and all this stuff. Like I don't want that much attention on me. And Alex saying, Juan, you wrote a solo play. So, yeah, there's no way around it. And I have a concern of watching solo plays that are like that, when people are praising themselves without, and maybe criticizing other things without taking responsibility for their own things. Like that irks me. Or there's not it might feel like a higher purpose, or there's something in there that they're digging deep. I have a challenging time, but I will still watch solo plays. I don't let one bad experience make me go, I'm never gonna, that's why I hate them. But I just trusted honestly, if I didn't have Alex involved, I don't know what would have happened, because he just kept pushing me. He saw something there. He was my eyes outside of it to help me just trust in what I was talking about.
Well, no, I loved what you said about your family coming to the table with stories for you. Most families pick one member unconsciously, and everybody's family here, to be the keeper of the stories.
Yes.
And it's ancient. I don't know if we have to be so afraid. And every time we tell a story or a joke, it gets better and better, because people don't listen, right? If they don't like it, you start shortcutting, you start changing. Oh, they're not laughing. Okay, I'm going to move through that part. The act of telling carves out so much just by your act of telling. And it is so ancient. So I think there's a trust of that. And I just one more thing I want to add about stories is Joseph Campbell was the great mythologist, said, if you want to know who you are right now, every person in this room, what was the story that you as a little boy or girl clung to? Mm-hmm. What did you repeat in your head over and over, or made your mom or dad read it over and over, because you developed your own self as a protagonist, and you made sense of your life, whether it was an ugly duckling and you were going to have a promise, whatever that story was. So I think it's so natural. I don't think it's as mysterious. I think it's more ancient than a play, and more known than a play.
I got one more thing on that. So sorry.
We can stay on just this.
An action thing you can do. So when we were at Second Story, we developed all these ways to develop your story that created different ways that people learn and process, because we all come to story differently. And one of my favorite things was, we had a storyteller who, whenever he was ready to tell, he wanted a hit story he wanted to tell, he would like secretly use his friends as an audience. So he would take them out for dinner or drinks. And at some point he knew he was going to tell this story. And at some point he would tell the story, but just like naturally he wouldn't tell them what was happening. And he would be looking for their reactions. So he did this with a few different friend groups, so we could start to hone the story he wanted to tell, and what people had questions about, and do it in a way that they didn't know they were giving him notes. So there was no ego. It was just like, what do they really want to hear me talk about, and what bores the hell out of them? I thought that was good. I still do that.
Well, it's so real, isn't it? If you go to a New York workshop and they're telling a story, everybody's judging and they're putting their quick comments. Right. That's an audience. Right. That's a real audience, is your friends. And it was Edward Albee who said, you don't write for an idea, you write for your friends.
Dee, let's get another question or two in.
Okay, we have a question from Tracy. Tracy, I am getting ready to unmute you. You have to give me permission to do it. All right.
Hey, Tracy.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for doing this. I just want to ask because I'm working on writing a one-woman show right now, and I want to write a full-length, a full-length play, not just a series of monologues. What's the best way to use multiple characters in one scene, like 2 or 3 characters in one scene? What's the best way to do that and to transition between scenes?
I'm gonna talk because that's my favorite. The thing I love to do most on stage is hop from voice to voice. It is like legitimately, if you ask me legitimately, if you're like, what's the most important thing about doing solo, is that I can be ridiculous and take on 6 voices in one scene. Like, that's what I love. But actually, I'm gonna throw I'm gonna throw some knowledge out that I got from a teacher. I'm trying to have her name come to me because I don't want to share her language without it, but if not, I'll name it after this. Can you tell that my brain works like this? So a couple things she gave me was, there's a structure in solo show that you can access, which is you're not just the narrator voice, but like Juan said, there might be a part of you that's living in the moment of what happened, and then there's a part of you living now and looking back at what happened. And then there might be the characters that you play. And so within that, you can be as real as you were in the moment, and then you can also share with the audience what you know now. It's almost like the, soliloquy in Shakespeare. Not almost, it is, right? So it's like when they turn to the audience and you're like, and then like, look at what's happening here. This, I was gonna swear, I won't swear. This person over here is blah, 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 so you can use that medium to tell a story more honestly, and it also lets you be more raw. So if you remember, a play that has been a deep part of my life is For Color Girls, and while it's not a solo show, the lady in red at the end is a solo show, right? It is this piece where I think it's the hardest piece of theater in the American theater to perform, and one of the secrets, I think, to performing that piece is she's telling this story, this horrific story about this woman whose babies are dropped off a ledge, right? So one thing has to happen is that she has to be totally in the truth of that story when she's reading from the character's point of view of the mother, which sometimes she pops into. But there's also, the narrator is also watching in that story, right? So if the actor is not able to pop out of the emotion of being with her children and tell the audience, and then this happened, and then this happened, the audience will then worry for the actor instead of listen to the story, right? Because they'll be like, the actor is so upset, the actor is so emotional that I worry for their safety. So what you want to do is create mediums where you're showing the audience that you're in control of the story you're telling, so that you can be as emotionally free in one character and then kind of pop back into another character that's kind of centering us in what's happening. Okay, so you're watching this happen. This is going on right now. And like, you'll remember, I talk about in my show, if you've seen it, I don't know if you have, but I talk about a major loss I sustained because of racism. I had a doctor who didn't see me, and I was pregnant, and he put me in danger. I ultimately did lose the baby, although I don't tell the full story in the show. I stop at this moment where we knew the baby was still alive. It's and I let myself be as honest as I can be in that moment. And the next moment, I talk to you about Beyonce. And the reason for that is I want you to know how much that destroyed me, and it did. But I also want you to know this isn't a play about me getting lost in sorrow. This is a play that is about you and me together on a journey. So the reason I step out of sorrow is because I want the audience to know, this goes back actually, Eileen, to your question. Like, I also want the audience to know I'm not just up here like in a therapy session, right? Like, I'm up here having a dialogue with people. I don't know if that's helpful. So creating different narrators, even if that narrator is always yourself, that are different points of reference to come back to, and then distinct voices.
I want to take a moment here because and I know some of you were expecting to see him sooner. Brian Quijada was able to join us at the last minute here. Oh, hi, Brian, and I know that that he has some he wants to share with us here too. So welcome, Brian. Brian, of course, brought. Where did we sit on the bus to the Logan Festival?
How's it going? Yeah, sorry I'm so late, y'all. I got like I was protesting all morning, and kind of time got the best of me, and but I love this question because I feel like it's specifically in my own work. The thing that I love, that I'm really interested in solo work, is using body and like physicalization to like kind of differentiate. When I was in Chicago, I trained a lot with a theater called Silent Theater Company. My brother's a clown in Chicago, and I think a lot of that work was really helpful in a lot of my solo work because it's like super physicalized. I think to your question, when you're writing these with the intent to do it as a solo work, I think write it as you would a scene, knowing that you will use physicalization, changing of voices, like to the best of your ability to try and different. I mean, like I've loved seeing solo performances when there are 4 or 5 different, like a whole entire family having a conversation at a dinner table, and it's so incredibly clear because of different physicalization and different changes of voices, and that work kind of fascinates me. It's also like it's always an impressive thing to watch a performer be able to shift so clearly between those. That it's really intriguing work, and I really love it. So I say, like, don't get bogged down by being like, oh, who's the narrator? Write the scene that you want to see. Like Anna Devere Smith will morph into like a singular narrator that talks for a long time and then morph into another one. But if you're doing like split like conversation, a lot you can do in gaze, can do in like looking up or looking down if a child is involved, or changing of voices. I think that's work that's like a little down the line, but as you write, I think don't lose motivation that it cannot be done. It just requires a little bit of finesse.
And I think that's where the oral storytelling, when you're telling someone the story, like what's been talked about so far, you'll find out how to tell the story, and then it's just committing to the perspective of how they do it. I just look at it as it's just like a children's playground. For me, that's fun for me. You'll find some actors who do solo work and they don't go full out with exploring that kind of stuff, and that's more than okay. It's about what feels like how the story needs to be told, or how you feel strongest in how to tell that story.
Great. I want to try to get one more question in here. I know we have one more, Dee.
Okay, this question is coming from Debbie. I just have to find her on my queue. There she is. Debbie, I am unmuting you now. So you have to give me permission. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
My question is actually for Kate. I'm interested in how the 2 plays that you directed were the same and were different.
Great question.
How much time do we have, Al?
Not much, Kate. Sorry. We'll help you at it.
That is so big. Let me see if I can pull myself to start. That's an excellent question. I love both the gentlemen that I worked with. So the Unbearable Brightness, there I had less familiarity with. So being a Caucasian female, and we never know who Leonard Pelkey is if you didn't see it. We only know that he's an other in society. He's criticized, he's wonderful, and at the end he's brutalized. So he becomes a universal other. But Jeffrey, who was a gay man, he had the deep, deep experiences of being wounded by culture. And he had deep experiences within the things that he was participating in or talking about able to relate to them in a way that I didn't. So again, I think I go back to what I said first. I had to give space, so I didn't impose my thoughts. Yet I'm looking for the shared humanity of it. Jeffrey and I have done a lot of plays together, and it's giving him all that latitude and room. But if it's not familiar to me personally, then it's to be open, and I had a more studied look at what we were doing.
Mhm.
And then if we move to the things they carried, I have a deep relationship to the Vietnam War through older brothers that were there, and people on my street that came back without an arm or died. So that became also very personal, and I could delve more personally in that with David Sittler. So, and then it depends on where the author's point of view is. How close are they to their text? You know, David Sittler came from the I of the play. I did this, I did this, I did this. And Leonard Pelkey was all the different people in this magical town that were influenced. So understanding where the camera was, so to speak. Who are we looking at, from the outside in or the inside out? So they become then very different animals. And I don't think any play is ever the same. You go in the trenches and you come out hoping it's going to be great, but you have to go, I think, Alex, we talked about that, just inch by inch by inch in the trenches and then come out. So each one is a completely different world. And I never impose a style like, oh, this is a comedy or this is serial comic. I really don't like that in our field, that we do that. Every play is its own world, and we have to go find the world. Some worlds I'm really familiar with. Some I'm not, but it's just like an astronaut. I have to go in and be an observer of that world.
That's great.
Thank you.
I know we had more questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get to all of them. It's such a wonderful conversation, such a rich conversation. We could do 10 weeks of this. I'm just so grateful to all of you for being here, both to Kate and to Juan and to Brian and Khanisha, and to all of you who have joined us for this conversation. We are grateful for you. Sign up for the next few community conversations, Saturdays at 2 o'clock. I see a note from Dee that Arlene Malinowski, Khanisha, is that right?
Yeah.
The teacher Khanisha was referring to, and Khanisha wanted to prove that she could remember things.
But also,
But I had one thing, Alex.
I know Arlene is teaching virtual solo classes right now.
Oh, great.
The pandemic. So that's why I put her link on there, because she really, the whole second piece of Joy Rebel I developed with her.
That's great.
So it was such a good experience.
Thank you.
And may I add one thing, Alex?
Sure, of course.
Nobody knew this, and you didn't know this either, that happened. This goes back to the question, what was different?
Yeah.
I'm very close to the Métis Indians, Métis indigenous people. And it was very important that when we did Kiowa in the things they carried, which was the Indian character, that we respect them. So David and I did a ceremony on your grounds where we buried tobacco, red cloth, and asked that David be able to represent the indigenous people that had died and didn't have voice. And then we smudged and did all of this very in ceremony so that the play would hold that. And that was something we didn't do in the other, but it became very personal.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you. Thank you all. I know we ran a few minutes over this time, but we're just so grateful to you all. Please stay safe, everyone. And we miss you terribly and look forward
Alex,
to
before you let everybody go,
yes, please,
Juan has given us some information. We had a question about books to read. And so Juan has shared with us that PBS will be releasing Twilight of Rodney King's Riots. And then Monday, it'll be released. And then Anna Devere Smith I think that's the information that he's giving us.
So it's Anna Devere Smith's solo show, Twilight 92.
Yes.
That's going to be on PBS this week, I think.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would highly recommend that easily.
Yeah. Thank you all.